Did you think affordable, fun, non-rotating formats were dead? It's time to rise from the ashes with Pioneer and Izzet Phoenix. Izzet Phoenix, it is! Rising from the ashes of the ban list, this deck looks to match efficient and recoverable threats with control and tempo elements. The fast pace and aggressive creatures are enough fire to thaw even the thickest of ice counters. But before we can fly, we have to learn the deck. So let's learn to walk by starting with the threats. The namesake of the deck is the Arclight Phoenix, where for 3 and a red you get a 3/2 flyer with haste, which is not the greatest deal for our mana, but if it's in our yard and we cast 3 or more instant or sorcery spells in a turn, it comes back to play in our combat step. This means we can discard it to our many looting effects and never really pay for it. This is powerful too because so few cards in the Pioneer format actually exile. And when the most common removal spells in the format are Wild Slash and Fatal Push, your opponent is sure to struggle with keeping the Phoenix down for good. Since we're casting a lot of instants and sorceries to fuel our Phoenix, we should run other threats that will benefit from our high spell density. Thing in the Ice may look like a 0/4 defender, but once we cast 4 instant or sorcery spells to remove the ice counters, it becomes a 7/8 horror for our opponent and clears all non-horrors back to the hand. And that all but assures it will connect and send our opponents back a few turns on board. And since our Phoenixes don't come back till combat step, it's often we can flip thing and get back the Phoenixes all in the same turn for a devastating turn of damage. An important note, the ice counters are on a cast trigger, so with spells like Lightning Axe or Magma Spray, if they remove the last counter, the transform and bounce effect will resolve first. So if something needs to die rather than bounce, plan accordingly. We can also use this to cast Lightning Axe and target our thing if it's the last ice counter, as it will have 8 toughness on resolution. Thing's weakness is it's easily removed, so patience may be required to find a turn where it can be played and flipped, all while our opponent is tapped out or played with protection. We're also going to run a pair of young Pyromancers, who are fueled by our high count of instants and sorceries. Pyromancer keeps us attacking from different angles as the elemental tokens give us a go-wide strategy. Young Pyromancer tokens are an army in a can and hand block for trades on defense, and attack for lethal when we're ahead. If our opponents can't answer them, they will drown in an avalanche of 1/1s. Now, it might be tempting to cast Pyromancer on turn 2, but another strategy is to wait until we can cast it with 2 spells at least on the same turn so that we get some value, as literally any spell in the format will send our Pyromancer to the yard far before their time. But getting just 2 tokens to continue the assault can be the final points of damage we need to keep our opponent on the back foot before toppling over. Since we are only playing 10 creatures, we need to make sure we find them, and we also want to cast a lot of instant and sorceries, so let's move on to the dig. Starting things off short and simple, we have the classic Opt. Now, Opt plays a bit differently than in other decks, as we want to use it to find a threat, but if we already have one, we want to save it in order to trigger our threats, as it's a 1-mana spell which becomes very valuable to casting 3 in a turn or 4 to flip a thing, so remember to save it when you already have your threat and cast it when you need to find a threat. Another card we cast differently depending on if we have a threat or not is Chart a Course. With no threat, we can't attack, and we need to cast it just to get our threat. But if we have a Phoenix in hand, we're going to want to cast it pre-combat. Strategic Planning is a great turn 2 setup card, as we run 3 to shape our hand while possibly throwing a Phoenix into the yard and always fueling our yard. It doesn't put us up in cards, and it isn't as efficient as Opt, but it's great for when you're looking for a threat. 4 copies of the amazingly powerful and amazingly not banned Treasure Cruise let us turn our used spells into cold hard cards. 3 of them to be exact. We can't recur our spells in this deck, so don't be afraid to delve away anything and everything that isn't a Phoenix. To round out our deck, we have what's a bit of a Swiss Army knife with a pair of the Royal Scions. This 3-mana Planeswalker will let us loot every turn and make whatever threats we find that much more lethal with a +2/+0 trample and first strike, which will assure us air superiority on a Phoenix and make sure our thing in the ice gets past all chumps our opponents wants so desperately to block with. Both abilities tick the twins up to their ultimate, which refills our hand and could give us enough damage damage to finish off an opponent, or at least answer a big creature or planeswalker of theirs. So now that we're digging, we need to use our mana to keep our opponents in line, and that brings us to the control. Pioneer is the format of 1-drops, from Llanowar Elves and Geese to Blood-Soaked Champions and Swift Spears. So we are gonna need answers, especially for those pesky elves. The deck runs 4 copies of Wild Slash and 2 more copies of Magma Spray. Those slashes do it all, from poking the face to finishing off walkers, all with the added bonus of beating Fog when we have a flipped Horror or Scion pumped Phoenix. The Magma Sprays give us a little extra turn 1 interaction, and it sends annoying beaters like Blood-Soaked Champion and Gutterbones packing for good. We also run 3 copies of Lightning Axe, which can be cast on turn 1 if we need to, but hopefully we are using it to discard a Phoenix and take out a bigger threat later in the game. Now, if your opponent opens with a Mana Dork on turn 1, remember, bolt the bird. Well, wait, we don't have bolt or bird, but you should axe the elves. Hey, I like that. Axe the elves, especially if that's your only option for early game interaction. You can also apply that to the goose. Axe the goose. The last control card in the main board is quite a doozy and the workhorse of the deck, an Izzet Charm. Izzet Charm? Yes, it is. This clever charm lets us pick a mode from 3. Mode 1 is counter a non-creature spell unless they pay 2. This shuts down key spells like Fires of Invention. It also lets us protect our threats from removal spells early in the game when mana is tight. Mode 2 is to deal 2 damage to target creature. More removal to pick off our opponent's early game tempo and utility creatures. Mode 3 is draw 2 cards and then discard 2 cards. We can use this to sculpt a hand or to drop some phoenixes into the yard. Is it phoenixes or phenai? Either way, now that we see what spells we're casting, how are we going to do that in a fetchless format? In Pioneer, the fetchless format, mana is actually quite good for enemy color pairs. We of course get the Shockland of Steam Vents ×4, and there's also fast lands with 4 Spire Bluff Canals. Sheevan Reef might cost us life, but it's well worth the untapped efficiency of the land, so 4 of those as well. Sulphur Falls is another great land for our colors, but running 4 could lead to awkward hands with 2 falls or 2 falls and a reef, so it's best that we keep this to 2 copies total for the deck. We round out our 20 land base with 2 mountains and 4 islands. Nothing too fancy in this mana base, just efficient colored mana with almost exclusively untapped lands. Let's move into the sideboard and see how our options change in games 2 or 3. The sideboard is mostly about switching up our threats to keep our opponents guessing. Thing in the Ice is weak against black-green decks, as it dies to Fatal Push, and Phoenix is going to be weak to Graveyard Hate, so we have 6 other options for substitute threats. We can swap in 2 copies of Chandra, Torch of Defiance, to give us another threat that doesn't die to Abrupt Decay. She can accidentally exile your Phoenixes, so be sure to take out a few when you bring her in. Chandra also excels against mid-range, as she can come down and nuke a creature, then threaten to climb up to ultimate. Brazen Borrower is a mischievous fae who not only is a flash flyer that will bring the beats to our opponent's face, but can also bounce anything that needs to go, setting your opponent's back a turn and turning the tide of the game. Sphinx's tutelage is fun to say, but it also lets us attack from an entirely new angle. Not only is it an enchantment, a card type that wasn't part of our main plan, but it also attacks the deck rather than the life total. The Powerhouse enchantment mills our opponent at least 2 cards for every card we draw, and with charts, cruises, and ops, we will be able to demolish the opposing deck faster than they can say, "Wait, can I read that?" Moving on from alternate threats, we have a suite of counter magic, mostly for other blue matchups, with 2 Mythical Dispute and 1 each of Spell Pierce and Negate. 2 copies of Fry allows us to fight our number 1 enemies, Narset and Teferi, as well as a few Angels or anything in the mono blue decks. Sweltering Suns and Beacon Bolt are for creature-dense decks where we need our removal spells to kill more than 1 creature. And finally, we're going to play 1 copy of By Force, just to catch those in Soul and Hardened Scales decks. Pioneer Phoenix is quite competitive, and you may want to adjust the sideboard to your local meta. I suggest this deck for anyone who likes their turns to feel like a giant puzzle, as you constantly try to determine when you need to make a 3-spell turn turn happen and when you can take a turn to set up and make your big turn bigger. If you wish to defeat this deck, cards like Narset and Teferi Time Raveler really hinder it, as does typical Graveyard Hate. Special thanks to this deck's professional consultant, Ricky of Door Monster. Once again, I was very happy to guest on a Door Monster episode, and I'll link that episode in this video's description. And I hope very much this deck has been of some help to you. You can help me out by remembering to like, share, subscribe, or just by leaving a message. What deck would you like to see a tech on next? Let me know in those comments below. And this program was made possible thanks to a sponsorship from Card Kingdom, as well as the Patreon support of viewers such as you. So thank you.